Welcome to our fourth social justice debates training. Today's session is going to focus on case construction for our topic, and let's just probably allow another 3 or 4 minutes for folks to come in. In usual Ken fashion, I will be turning on my camera, and I will ask everyone who can to also turn on their cameras so that I don't have to speak completely to a black screen. Jones, you can't hear a thing because we didn't start yet. I was waiting on a few more people to join us. I see people were still coming in. We're going to start by 10 minutes after sharp. So in exactly about 3 minutes, I will start. Short preamble, I guess, for those of you who are just joining us and wondering um, what's today all about? Well, today's all about case construction. If your partner is not here, that's okay. This session is being recorded, and I understand, like previous sessions, will be shared. I will also be sharing my slides. I do have slides today. I know some people are visual learners and don't want to just hear someone talk. They need to see it on their screens. So hopefully everyone's not on a phone, because you can certainly see the slides better if you're on a device with a bigger screen. But I will be sharing the slides in any event following this presentation. Actually, you know what? It's no time like the present. If you have access to the chat, I'm going to try to share my slide deck actually in the chat right now. So give me a moment.
Kenny can share it with me, then I just add it to the drive that we have for the social justice materials.
Okay, great. You want me to email that to you now, Farissa?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, Farissa, that has been sent. And with that said, I will turn back on my camera. I will ask everyone who can to turn on their cameras as well, just so I could have one or two, maybe smiling faces to see. I do understand that Tanzania time, we're in the evening, so people may be reluctant for whatever reason to share your beautiful smiling faces. Uh, I'm going to try to share my screen so you can see. Hey, Jones, good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, good to see you, Prof.
Yes. Let me share my screen so that everyone can see what we got going on today. Okay, everyone should be able to now see my screen. You should be able to see a presentation that says case construction for social justice debates. If someone could just confirm for me you're seeing it okay, then I know we're good to go. And that's anyone can confirm you can see it. I just need one person to confirm. Good.
Yeah, I can see it, Coach.
Okay, perfect. All right, so what we're talking about today, everyone, hopefully by now, based on the previous sessions and based on the fact that we released a topic a long time ago with some supporting evidence, everyone should be well under their way with their research for the topic. And hopefully you've started to at least think about putting together your cases, even if you haven't actually started writing your cases. I'm hopeful that today's session will help give you some guidance, some help, support on how to put together an effective case for the social justice debates and what you want to do. If you take away nothing else from today's session, I hope you take away the fact that there is no one way to put together a great case. And so one of the things I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover the things that you should think about when you're trying to put together a case. Where should you start, first of all? I'm going to cover the different frameworks of justice that you could begin to think about, both from the affirmative perspective and from the negative perspective. I'm going to cover the different types of cases that you could put together, because there's not, in fact, one type of case, and there's certainly not one option that's even available to you within the various types of cases that you could put together. Then I'm going to cover sort of what are the essential elements of your case. What do you need to have in there? I don't think you can have a good case in this format without having research and some evidence to support it. So I will also talk a little bit about organizing your research and making sure you get that ready for your case construction. Or the simplest way to think about it is, when you're making your case, you should let your research guide you. So it's good to start off with an idea for what a case might be, but then you have to test that idea by doing the research and finding evidence to support those ideas. and then you let that research and that evidence kind of guide you. And then I'll talk about sort of the various types of cases. I'll give you some examples, both from an affirmative and a negative perspective. And then after we go through those examples and sample cases, then we will have a Q&A, and that'll be your opportunity to pick my brain about whatever questions you have left. Although those of you who've heard me lecture before know I prefer an interactive style of lecture, so I don't plan to just talk at you for the next hour. If you have a question at any time about something that I am saying, all you need to do is to raise your hand. I do have multiple screens up, so if it looks like I'm not looking directly at you, it's because I'm actually working off of 2 or 3 screens to make sure that I'm managing everything pretty well. So, but if you raise your hand, then I will pause at the appropriate time and then call upon you and try to do my best to answer your question. Okay, that said, let's get started with case construction. If my slide presentation will advance and stop pinwheeling. There we go. So the first thing you want to start with when it talks about when you think about case construction is you want to make sure you've understood the motion, right? The motion we have here is a just migration system in the East African community is best achieved through the full implementation of the Common Market Protocol rather than prioritizing recruitment and protection measures. Now, if you've read the topic statement, and I hope you all have read the topic statement, the topic statement tries to clarify what the debate is all about. Within the topic statement, there is a definition for just migration system. Within the topic statement, there is clarification about what does it mean for full implementation of the Common Market Protocol. Short version, it means the removal of barriers to free labor migration so that people can move and go about freely, particularly within the East African region. And it clarifies what the motion means by prioritizing recruitment and protection measures. The purposes of clarifying that from the topic statement is so that the debate doesn't get bogged down in what do these terms mean, and what are these terms supposed to mean, with the exception of justice, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the idea is that everyone is on the same footing, the same starting place when it comes to what is this debate supposed to be about. And I don't know if you all have your topic statements with you handy, if you're in a good place where you can reference them. I'm going to just grab mine really quickly because there's one thing I wanted to point out about the topic statement. Oh, you're all seeing that screen. I didn't even see that screen, but it's okay. I intended to bring up the other screen. Bear with me. Oh, screen sharing fun. When you work off multiple screens, you never know which screen is going to maximize or minimize sometimes. There we go. Oh, we're back. In any event, if you have the topic statement, I promise you, I was going to pull it up, but there is a clarifying. All the definitions of these phrases are clarified. Secondly, you need to think about what type of motion do we have. There are different types of motions. Generally speaking, you can categorize motions into, for our purposes, there are really 3 types of motions. There's policy, value, and fact motions. I'm going to just focus on policy and value for a second. So what's a policy motion? Policy motion is a motion that calls for some type of policy action or some type of implementation. So you usually have some actor that is trying to address some problem that is inherent in the status quo, and they want to solve that problem by presenting some type of plan and that will accrue certain benefits. That's generally what you're dealing with when you talk about policy. As compared to when you're talking about a value motion or a principle motion, which is usually calling for a side to uphold a particular principle or value, and their case usually revolves around showing or demonstrating why their side upholds that value or that principle the best after even establishing that's a value or a principle we should care about. Now, here, what type of motion is this? Well, I've already kind of given you the answer on the slide, right? This is a comparative policy resolution. What do I mean by that? Well, three things. Number one, you have to argue which approach to a just migration system is better. So it's not just about whether either side is sort of good on its own. In other words, if you designed a case that just showed full implementation of the Common Market Protocol was a good idea, that wouldn't be good enough. Conversely, if you were negative and you just had a case that showed prioritizing recruitment and protection measures is a good idea, that wouldn't be good enough. It's got to be comparative, meaning the debate is calling for you to compare these two options. And so rather than doing or focusing on one or the other, which is better? The second part, what's the policy part? Well, the policy part is the fact that we're evaluating the Common Market Protocol as a policy rather than policies that would prioritize recruitment and protection measures. But then, of course, the third element, which you may have guessed, is the value element or the principle element, meaning we're having this debate take place in the context of what is best to uphold justice. What is best to uphold justice? And that, let me suggest to you, is not necessarily a straightforward answer. But that's the context in which we're having this debate and we're having the discussion. And so you should make sure you understand the motion. So you should understand that just migration is about what? Fair and equitable treatment for migrant workers through rights, protection, and inclusion. The Common Market Protocol, you should have read up on that. That's about the regional integration policy, which is aimed at free movement across EAC borders. When I say EAC, you know I mean the East African Community. Hopefully everyone knows that acronym by now. And then recruitment and protection measures, what do we mean by that? We mean national policies, such as those regulating recruitment agencies, bilateral labor agreements, and direct labor protections. And so you've got to make sure that you've analyzed these competing approaches. On one hand, I think for the affirmative, that means emphasizing systemic economic integration and structural justice. And on the other hand, for the negative, I think the negative is going to focus generally on sort of immediate risk mitigation and labor safeguards in order to protect workers. And so in the end, your case should answer a few key questions. One, is justice better achieved through universal access to structural reform, i.e. the affirmative, or through targeted intervention and worker protection, i.e. the negative side? Your case should think about what groups benefit or may be left behind in each approach. And lastly, you need to consider the timeline for justice and which one matters most, whether it's sort of short-term justice we might be able to achieve or whether it's sort of more long-term justice or the justice that we get when we focus on sort of long-term policy solutions. And so, yeah, I think I've covered these key terms and concepts. I'm gonna keep moving. And so, yeah, those are the key compete approaches and questions. Let me pause here before we start talking about different frameworks of justice. Does everyone understand sort of that general approach to case construction before we start getting into specifics? Great, no questions. I don't see any hands. I do see one person in the waiting. All right, let's talk a little bit about justice because I don't know how many of you are philosophy students or just love philosophy or principle-based arguments, but certainly philosophers, theorists, even religious scholars, political science majors, a lot of folks like to think about justice and write about justice, and certainly justice can be thought about in different ways. So there are various frameworks of justice that one could think about. And these frameworks for justice, they often compete or trade off one another. In other words, justice from the affirmative perspective may be a little bit different than the way justice looks like from the negative perspective. So let's talk about sort of from the affirmative perspective first a little bit for justice, because there are, I think, a few different ways to think about sort of justice as a principle from the affirmative perspective. And by the way, which way is appropriate or is best for your case completely and totally depends on your choice of advocacy. In other words, there is no one way. That is correct. And indeed, I think it's a fair part of the debate to debate about what is the best framework for justice. So from the affirmative perspective, you could think about justice as fairness. If you want to read up from a philosopher by the name of John Rawls, because this is not a lecture on justice, I'm giving you some ideas, some basis to think about. You could go much deeper on any of these concepts that I'm going to cover. This is intended to give you a broad overview. But a philosopher by the name of John Rawls thought about justice as sort of synonymous with fairness. And when you think about justice as fairness, then you think of, in the context of the topic, you think about workers needing to be provided with equal access to opportunities in order to really have labor justice. That on the other hand, a different way to think about justice is for a structural justice perspective. If you want to do some reading by a philosopher by the name of Amartya Sen, who focuses on systemic conditions that allow individuals to access opportunity, that's a very different way of sort of thinking about what justice means. And so if you think about justice from, say, from the perspective of equal opportunity, then workers should not face border-based discrimination in access to employment opportunities, right? And that's sort of consistent if you think about the full implementation of the CMP. What's it trying to do? One of the goals I would think would be to try to create equal opportunity for all workers in Eastern Africa. So it doesn't matter where you live, you still have the equal opportunity to gain access to employment and to jobs within that region. Another way to think about it might be regional justice. In this perspective of regional justice, justice requires coordinated solutions across borders rather than fragmented national policies. So if you're thinking about justice from a regional justice perspective, you would say there can be no justice if we don't have regional coordination. In other words, if you're just purely individualistic or more nationalistic in your focus, which some negative teams might be. Again, we're thinking about frameworks of justice right now from an affirmative perspective. So I'll give you an example. Imagine the Uganda-Kenya labor gaps that are filled legally through the CMP and how they could create equal economic opportunity across the EAC. In other words, if we sort of eliminate all of those restrictions or even permit fees that folks face when trying to work together across those borders. Which means people keep coming, which I love. I love people continuing to come in, but it does require me to pause and click it, admit. So these are some different frameworks for justice you might think about from an affirmative perspective. On the other hand, from a negative perspective, it's going to seem you may think about justice very, very differently, right? So from a negative perspective, when you're focused on sort of prioritizing worker recruitment and protection, you could first think about justice as equity. No, justice as equity is very different than like justice as equal opportunity. So justice as equity would focus on sort of those individuals who are most at risk, people like low-skilled workers, informal workers, external migrants, and why their individual interests should be prioritized. When you're thinking about justice as equity, equity is often concerned about outcome. In other words, at the end of the day, are these people protected? Whereas you can think, if you think about justice as fairness or equal opportunity, that's making sure everyone sort of has an equal and fair playing field from the start or at the beginning. It's not as much concerned with, well, how did they end up? What happened at the end? Did we get an equitable result? Because as long as we got an equal opportunity in the start, justice is fairness is equality would say, hey, let the chips fall where they may, people end up kind of where they end up. But from justice as equity would disagree with that position because they will be concerned with, well, wait a minute, at the end of the day, did we get an equitable result? Was the system that we created actually fair to protect everyone, not just in giving them an opportunity, but in reality? And if I sound slightly biased towards one approach or the other, that's not the intent. My intent here is only to illustrate these competing approaches. A different way you might approach justice from a negative perspective is from a human rights-based approach, thinking about protection from abuse as being sort of a baseline human right, not some future aspiration. Not like, okay, we need to protect workers eventually, but first we need to implement this policy like CMP. No, we need to make sure workers are protected right now, immediately. Certain worker protections and exploitation are baseline human rights. For example, if you've been doing some reading on the topic, there's a considerable amount of literature about exploitation that happens with people from the East African community when they go to gain labor opportunities in the Gulf states, right? And within the Persian Gulf area. So you can think about that from a perspective. A third approach or perspective from a framework of justice would be sort of a timing thing. Justice now versus justice later. It is not uncommon for structural changes to take time. Indeed, the CMP has been around for a while. It's been around since, I believe, 2010, and still hasn't yet to be fully implemented. And so structural changes takes time. Some people would say, well, justice delayed is, in fact, justice denied, and we need to protect workers right now. And that's the only real way we have justice, is if people are protected now in the short term, as opposed to your laudable goal of protecting workers in the long term through the full implementation of the CMP. But we don't consider that real justice. It may be if we're on the negative side. And so, for example, Kenya had a temporary ban on migration to Saudi Arabia, which led to bilateral protections that saved a lot of lives immediately. So that would be an example of justice in the short term as opposed to justice in the long term. All right, I'm gonna pause there. Any sort of questions about different competing frameworks of justice? What do I want you to take away from this? I want you to have thought about this, right? The whole debate is obviously not this. This is a part of the debate. It's definitely not the whole debate, but I think it's sort of underlying. It's one of those principal tensions. And if you just say, well, justice is justice, of course, we all care about justice. That's kind of a given in most social justice debates, that we all care about the principle of justice. But how we achieve that justice and what it means for a policy to be just, well, that question itself has different answers. And a few people coming in. Any questions before I move on? Okay, I see no hands, so I will keep it moving. So let's talk about the types of cases now. So
sorry, Professor Ken. There's a question.
It's okay, Jones. Go ahead.
There's a question I wrote in the comment section.
Oh, I didn't see the comments up. Okay.
Yeah. So I was asking. Does this
I
mean
see
that
your
we
question. I'll say it for everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
So this means we can't simply generalize justice. Well, so that's a strategic question, right, Jones? Can you generalize justice? Yes, you can generalize justice, but then you should not be surprised if you generalize justice. Let's say you're an affirmative, and you give your first affirmative constructive, and then your opponent from the negative perspective says, well, my opponent doesn't really understand what justice means. Justice means, like, if I'm negative, I stand up and I say justice means equity, and we need to be concerned about the outcome, and we need justice now. We don't have time to wait. And so we believe from the negative perspective that if your justice takes 100 years just to achieve protections for people and change, that's not really just at all. And then that's the framework in which then now they're going to present their case. You may probably in your next speech want to push back on that and not just accept that. Whether or not you want to sort of offensively frame what your concept of justice is or what justice means, that's up. I leave that up to you, but that's something you should think about when you're constructing your case. So you think about debate in two ways. You could think about debates in terms of rules, which is like, what do I have to do if I don't do this thing, then I'm breaking a rule? Then there is, let's just call it strategy, right? What is a good idea to do? Everything that I'm covering in this lecture falls into the latter category in terms of strategy, not rules, right? So if you don't do this thing, you're not breaking a rule. We're talking about what is effective really for debate in this particular format. Although I tend to think understanding the principle that underlies your position is one of those universal things that applies across debate formats.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's very well understood.
Great. All right, so let's talk about types of cases. And so I told you earlier there were a few different types of cases. Oh, I'm sorry. There's another question. Rinson, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask whether we are just going to narrow this motion based on the matters labor, or we can extend even to the economic stability and like the way they do businesses, etc. Then the second question, it was on the idea of, like, I saw the East African community countries, the ones that were listed as per that, the material that you provided. So are we also going to include like some of the countries like the Republic of Somalia and something of the sort, which is basically the ones that you highlight?
Yeah, so because the motion focuses on the East African community, in other words, the question that's presented for debate is what is best for the East African community. The debate should be centered around that, but that doesn't mean that examples from outside of the East African community are not relevant to the debate or the discussion. Indeed, I would think that they are. But it will be, your burden as the speaker to explain sort of the like with any debate, right? The relevance of the example that you're using. But we do want to center the debate on what is best for the East African community. After all, remember, finals is going to, if you didn't know, finals is going to take place at the EAC's headquarters. So we're literally going to be at the headquarters of the EAC, which is located, in Arusha, which is why we kind of chose this topic in the first place. I think you had another question. I answered your second question first, maybe. Your first question was about focus and limitation, or how far you can take the debate. Yeah, you'll see when we get into a little bit more specifics about different types of cases, or arguments rather, you can run, that there's no real limitation, I would say, on how far you can take the debate in terms of once you've got a case that, let's say you're affirmative, and you've got a case that focuses on, say, eliminating all permit fees. If you want to argue, listen, there's not just worker benefits for that, or justice benefits. There are all kinds of economic benefits. There's benefits for businesses, et cetera, et cetera. There's no limitation on the benefits that you can claim in terms of, you're not like limited by the topic. In that sense, the topic is intended to provide focus for what the ultimate debate should be about in terms of the clash that's happening in the debate. Does that answer your question? If not, please ask a follow-up. I want to make sure I answer it. Okay, hearing none, I think we're good. So let's talk about these types of cases. And so when we talk about policy, think about policy cases, we're talking about, actionable solutions, right? The policy has some specific policy proposal. I'm going to go through some examples of different policy proposals. I think you could advocate. Which policy proposal you advocate, of course, is your choice. A value case, of course, has principled arguments. How you operationalize justice, I think, in this context is how that becomes relevant. And of course, a hybrid case is going to combine both the moral and the practical elements, which is what you're going to be doing, I think, in these debates. Come on in, Ebenezer. So let's talk a little bit about some policy proposals first from the affirmative perspective. In other words, when we talk about full implementation of the CMP, what on earth are we talking about? And this is a list of 10 examples. By no means is this like an exhaustive list, meaning there could be more examples than this. I just came up with 10 so I could illustrate just how many different options there were. Your case could focus on one of these policy proposals, or it could focus on a combination of these policy proposals. Quentin, you have a question? Or maybe not, maybe just mute then. If you don't have, here, I'll mute you. Or it could focus on a combination of these options, or you can say, you know, I saw that Professor Newby list. That was a nice list, but me and my partner did some research and we actually came up with something that wasn't even on this list. That's okay too. I love that creativity. But let's go through a few of these options for illustration. One, you could have a policy that eliminates worker permit fees for all EAC citizens to ensure their free legal movement. Many EAC countries do have worker permit fees. Like, that is the status quo right now, and there's lots of good literature on the potential benefits of getting rid of those worker permit fees. You could expand the CMP coverage to include low-skilled and informal workers, since there is since the CMP has tended to focus on skilled labor, and so there is some notion that low-skilled labor has sort of been left out. And so you can say, well, by full implementation, we mean that we need to make sure that everyone is covered and that no worker is left behind. You could introduce something I'll call an EAC work card that sort of serves as a recognized regional work authorization, meaning, hey, if you have an EAC work card, you can work anywhere within the EAC and you're good. You could establish a regional labor rights body to monitor and enforce migrant protections, meaning if there is a violation of workers' rights, how does that worker get any redress? Right? And so maybe in other parts of the world, for example, there are regional organizations that protect rights, and EAC, I don't think, has one, so that's very strong right now. So you could make that policy proposal and establish that. You could have a proposal that harmonizes labor laws and social protections across EAC member states. What does that look like? This looks like, when it comes to certain labor laws or labor protections, the law in Tanzania being the same as the law in Uganda, being the same as the law in Kenya. Which law specifically? Well, that'd be up to you to specify in your affirmative plan or policy proposal. You could tie CMP compliance to certain incentives, such as access to regional development funds, to give countries a greater incentive to actually implement the CMP. You could say, well, look, the problem with CMP implementation or lack of full implementation doesn't have anything to do with the laws at all. We need to have an awareness campaign. We need more education. People just don't know. And so you could advocate for the launching of a public awareness campaign to educate workers and employers about CMP rights, which again are existing on the books. You could set up a labor mobility center at key border crossings to provide additional support and documentation for workers who are traversing these borders. You could empower the East African Court of Justice to adjudicate labor migration violations. I believe the East African Court of Justice is also located in Arusha, if I'm not wrong. That might be a nice little side excursion if we can squeeze some time in. I think I'd like to stop by there. Or you could adopt a sort of a regional CMP action plan that sort of has clear phased implementation with measurable benchmarks. So we're not just left with sort of the more general status quo of, we're trying to fully implement the CMP, even if it's taking forever. and hasn't been fully realized. So hopefully this gives you like some idea of all the various options that you have available to you for implementation options if you're affirmative. What about you guys? Anyone have any ideas for affirmative plans or that aren't on this list that you've been researching or been thinking about you want to share? No, everyone wants to keep their case a secret. No one wants to talk publicly, make it interactive. I see no one's cameras on either. I'm still going to try to encourage people to turn their camera on. Maybe one or two. No, maybe Dulcie. No. All right. Let's go to negative case options. So if you want to prioritize recruitment and protection measures, what do those policy proposals look like from a negative perspective? Well, I think they can look like, again, one or more of these options. Strictly licensing and monitoring recruitment agencies to prevent fraud and abuse, signing some type of bilateral labor agreements. Notice a bilateral labor agreement is different than a regional labor agreement. Bilateral is just one nation. That's like Kenya and Tanzania decide to sign an agreement with each other, with destination countries to ensure worker protections abroad. That could look like third option, banning migration to high-risk countries until safety conditions improve. In other words, look, we're not going to allow our workers to go to certain places if those places won't guarantee their safety and their protection. Fourth option, requiring pre-departure training for all migrant workers on their rights and risks so that if people are going to migrate outside of their home country, at least they can know what their rights are, and we can sort of ensure that from a state perspective. Fifth option, we could create migrant welfare funds to support workers who are finding themselves in a crisis situation because they've migrated to a different country, and now maybe they've been exploited or they're victims of exploitation that they didn't expect, and now they find themselves, I don't know, without funds, they need to get home. So I can think of a variety of ways you might use a fund like that for migrant welfare. Sixth option, you could deploy labor attaches and embassies to assist and protect citizens working overseas. Seventh, you might increase labor inspections in sectors that hire migrants to enforce safety and wage laws. Eighth, you might set up migrant worker hotlines and legal aid services for reporting abuse so that if someone is being abused or exploited, they have someone or somewhere to call to reach out to. Ninth, you might register all recruitment contracts in a national database to improve oversight. And then, in other words, we want everyone who's recruiting people to go abroad to actually register so we can keep track of you so people aren't sort of recruiting people in the dark and then doing whatever they want with them because no one really knows who's doing this. Or 10th option, again, run awareness campaigns to educate communities about safe migration. Notice that's different than the education campaign about the CMP, which was an affirmative suggestion. And so those are like 10 examples. Again, this list is not meant to be exhaustive of potential policy proposals, but from a negative perspective in terms of what are your options for prioritizing recruitment and protection of workers, what does that really look like? Hopefully these examples clarify that for you. Okay, seeing no questions, I'm going to keep moving. So what are the elements then of a strong case? I think one, framing. I think framing matters in every debate. I think, frankly, every debate speech should have some kind of framing within it. But certainly defining justice and what that means or that looks like for the groups that are affected or impacted by the motion, I think is important. I think secondly, what are your claims or your contentions or your argument? Sometimes people call these contentions, or just more simply stated, your arguments. Whether those arguments are moral arguments or practical arguments or consequential arguments, but you need to have some claims. I would say don't have have at least two, but probably four may be too many. Why do I say that? because your time is limited. You've only got 6-minute constructive speeches. With 6-minute constructive speeches, it doesn't give you sort of a lot of time to have too many big claims. And so I think it's better in this format to have 2 or 3 major claims or major arguments that are well structured and then well supported with evidence and logic, which are the warrants behind your claims. And then ultimately that you therefore then impact out, because the impacts are what get weighed in the debate at the end of the day. In other words, what's the real world effect of all this stuff? How does this affect trafficking? How does this affect abuse? How does this affect economic stagnation? There's a variety of different ways you can impact out various arguments, but in a strong case, you will have thought about all 4 of these key elements. In other words, how am I framing this debate and this discussion? What are my major claims or my major arguments? How am I supporting those claims or arguments? In other words, what evidence and logic, when I say logic, I mean reasons and analysis do we have to back up those claims and connect that evidence to the claim that we're making? And then what's the ultimate impact of that? I see a hand. Ebenezer, question.
Yeah, so I just had a question regarding claims.
Yes.
There were 6-minute speeches.
Yes.
And you suggest that we have 2 or 3 claims. Don't you think that having more claims would allow us to get more speaker points because we'd obviously be talking about more content?
So yes and no. So let's unpack that a little bit. And I'm going to show you some examples in a second, but let's say you tried to be ambitious. I would say overly ambitious. You got 5 big claims. What does that mean as a practical matter for your speech? That means you probably spent, let's be generous. Let's say you spent a minute on your introduction and your framing. So that's gone, right? Now we've got 5 minutes left. And so you've decided you've got 5 big claims. That means you're going to spend about a minute, right? If I'm just breaking it up equally on each one. Now, if I'm trying to introduce evidence and logic, in other words, I'm trying to have multiple reasons why that claim is true, can I do it in a minute for one big argument? Maybe, if I'm talking very fast. But remember, in this format, we want it to be accessible. We want it to be a format that's accessible to the public. And so in the United States, we have some formats where people talk ridiculously fast. I am not trying to recreate that bad practice. I mean, literally in the United States, we have some formats where people speak as fast as 300 words per minute. I've even seen people speak in high-level rounds of BP, let's say at World. I've seen people speak a little significantly faster, let's say, than, let's say, a conversational pace. And so, yeah, sure, the faster you speak, the more arguments that you can get in. And a lot of times debaters want to get as many arguments in, as many pieces of evidence in as they can in their speech. But that comes at a trade-off. And that trade-off is with your rhetoric. That trade-off is with how accessible your speech will be to a general audience. And what you need to remember is at the end of the day, the final rounds are not going to be judged by debate people, right? We're right now recruiting judges who we call stakeholder judges. So they're people from the community who work on this topic. So you may have people who are from the EAC, for example. Let's say you make it to finals. You have people from the EAC judging you in finals about full implementation of the EAC, whether this is actually a good idea or not. And so certainly if your speech is not accessible to them, it's going to be hard for you to win. And so I always say you have to think about your case that you're using in your preliminary rounds as being the same case that you want to use for your final rounds. It's not, expect or desire for you to try to change your case, right, throughout the tournament. And so when you think about case construction, to bring it back to your question, is this a good idea? I would say, again, there's no rule against this. This is strategic advice. I would say generally it's probably not a good idea. It's probably not going to work out well for you to have 5 arguments. Why? Because I can't tell you which one, but 1 or 2 of those arguments will probably be underdeveloped. And then the other arguments that would have otherwise been good arguments that you only spent a minute on could have been a better argument if you spent 2 minutes on it. It would have given you an opportunity to develop that argument in a way that 1 minute didn't give you the opportunity to develop it and therefore make your case stronger. Jones, camera on just so I can see you. You got a question?
No, but I just switched on the camera so that you could see me. So
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Ebenezer, did I answer your question? You have a follow-up?
Yes, you did. But that just I had an idea from that, and with that idea, I just want to ask a follow-up question, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
So, how do you determine whether, I mean, which claim is better than the other? Like, is it just based on evidence and how much like logic you have to back that claim, or?
Oh, I love this question. How do you determine which is what you're really asking is how do you determine your best arguments? Let me suggest to you that that is a very important judgment call that you have to make when you're constructing your case. I'll give you a few guidelines though. Number one, put your whatever you think is your most important argument, put it first. Always put whatever you think your most important argument. Judges give less credit to the arguments that you try to sneak in the last 30 seconds of your speech, for example. Just whatever it is, just won't seem as important as what you put forward. But secondly, when you're trying to decide, okay, well, which one should go forward then, Prof? You didn't answer my question yet. That's where you got to think about impact analysis. And literally, like my last slide of this presentation will give you sort of the 4 things you want to think about when you're trying to weigh your impacts. But let me suggest to you that whichever claims or arguments have the most significant impacts, those are probably your most important arguments. Those are probably your most important arguments. And how do you know which ones have the most significant impacts? I promise I'll answer that question before this presentation is over. There's a whole slide on it. But if I don't, ask me again at the end. All right, let's keep it moving. So I keep mentioning evidence. So I did want to mention a couple of tips just on sort of organizing your evidence, because that's what the purpose of research is, right? Research, you're looking for evidence. You're looking for, good quotes or statistics that can support the arguments that you want to make. I think first you start by using the topic statement sort of as a guide if you're not sure, oh my gosh, I'm not sure where to start. I'm not even sure like what are the subtopics within the topic that I'm supposed to be researching or looking at. Start by looking at the topic statement as your guideline. Secondly, try to track your themes. Try to track your themes. In other words, there are certain themes that come up. The more you research this, you start to recognize them, like formal versus informal labor, migration risks, enforcement gaps with the CMP, regional coordination. And these are just a few examples. There are a lot more different themes that you could track. But what you want to do is you want to make sure you're organizing your research so that you have easy access to it. That's the point. That's the significance of organizing your research. In this format, you can, you don't have to print everything out on paper, although if you bring paper, that's cool too. But you can bring devices into the debate. You can bring your laptop, you can bring your iPad, phone, you can use whatever you want. I do not suggest that you plan to do your research within the context of the debate. I think researching during the debate is generally probably a bad idea, because if you're trying to do that within like 6 minutes, because that's all they have for their speech, then you're probably missing the speech and missing important parts of the argument. So I don't think that's a good idea. But you can bring everything that you've researched and everything that you've brought, to the debate on your device and have access to. Other thing when you think about research is you want to make sure you're using reliable sources. So things from, say, trusted organizations like the AU or EAC reports or peer-reviewed academic research or reliable news sources. Just make sure you have good, decent sources. You're not just using, I don't know, some random guy's blog who decided to just opine about labor migration in East Africa. Like, for example, don't cite me. I'm far from an expert on the topic. Well, I'm a debate professor. I've got to do research on the topic to know anything about it, right? So I would consider myself, for example, a good, strong primary source on this topic. But organize your research. You want to make sure your research is well organized so that you have access to it, both in preparation and preparing for the debate. Because if you've done your homework, here's maybe the frustrating part. If you've never done a debate like this before, you're going to gather more research than you use. You're not going to be able to use everything you find. And some of the stuff you find is going to be really, really good. And maybe no one actually ever hears it. But if you've done that, let me suggest that if you've gotten to that level of research, that just means you're prepared. That's what it means to be prepared for the debate. I don't know how many of you are fond of a war book. I like war analogies for debate, but a famous Chinese general named Sun Tzu wrote a book called The Art of War. And there's a quote in it I like that says, "Every battle is won before it is fought." And so if you think about every debate round as a battle, how are you going to win the battle? Like that's the purpose of you preparing the case, right? That's going to be your sword. You're going to slice them up, you're going to chop them up, you're going to kill them at the tournament. But how do you know you're going to win? Well, every battle is won before it is fought, which means that you've got to put your focus now on your preparation. The person or the teams who prepare the best, I think, have the best chances in terms of the outcome. Because really, every time you do good research and you develop good arguments, that's when you're really winning the debates. When you get to the tournament, you're really just presenting all the great stuff that you found and showing how you really outworked your opponents before you even got there. So those are a few of my tips. Oh, more people coming. Great. Let's talk about different types of cases now. We talked about policy cases a little bit, value cases, comparative cases. There's also harm-based cases that focus on urgency and injustice. And they're what I'll call feasibility cases that maybe you want to focus on sort of just the practical dimensions and implementation challenges that have been faced by the CMP the last 15 years. Again, since it has been attempted to be fully implemented for a while now, you could easily have a whole 6 minutes on that alone. So first, let's talk with a policy case. What's the focus? The focus of a policy case is sort of the practical institutional implementation of the CMP versus the recruitment protection policies. You want to propose sort of a clear mechanism or a clear plan for what you're advocating. For example, removal of permit fees, or we want to harmonize labor standards. You want to try to use evidence from EAC countries showing the policy effectiveness or failure. In other words, you always, whenever you're advocating any kind of plan or mechanism, you want to have some type of evidence that what you're advocating is likely to work. It's likely to work. It's not just theoretically a good idea. It's actually a reality, a good idea. And then you want to evaluate implementation feasibility, enforcement mechanisms, and then the comparative outcomes. And so this looks like on the affirmative side, the CMP reduces structural barriers and creates long-term legal pathways, or regional job integration can solve for unemployment and informal labor exploitation. On the negative, this could look like saying, oh no, the CMP is just aspirational and it excludes vulnerable groups, for example, like unskilled workers. And so national protection laws, labor contracts, or bans on Gulf state migration are actually more enforceable now and are better policy options. And so a policy case are really best for teams who are very strong on their evidence, their mechanism analysis, and sort of that comparative analysis. I expect a lot of teams are going to have policy type cases on this motion. What about a value case? Well, a focus of a value case is a little different than a policy type case. It focuses on those competing ethical principles. In other words, what ought to be prioritized in a just migration system. And so we talked about how an affirmative value premise where justice could mean equality of opportunity and regional solidarity versus a negative value premise where justice means equity, dignity, and immediate protection for those who are most vulnerable. And so common clashes that you see with the value cases are sort of the structural justice approach versus immediate harm reduction, or the regionalism that's advocated by the affirmative versus sort of the national responsibility to protect individual workers or citizens from a particular nation on the negative, or long-term opportunities that we get with full implementation of the CMP versus sort of that short-term labor protection we get for the negative. And so for value case, I think it's best for debaters who really excel at philosophical framing, have a knowledge about justice theory and rhetorical clarity. But understand it's a very different way. It's an okay way to approach the debate. In other words, you could have a whole case that really just focuses on understanding this topic from your perspective that you've chosen for your framework of justice. You could have a whole principle case. Or let's go to the next option. Sorry, when I click next slide, there's like a short delay for whatever reason. So comparative outcomes case. So this could be a case where the focus is which model leads to better real world results for migrants. The approach here is using comparative examples from across EAC nations to show which approach leads to more employment, less exploitation, or greater regional fairness. In other words, notice I've set up sort of this framework, and then now we're comparing each side of the motion to see who better achieves these outcomes. So from the affirmative perspective, for example, CMP implementation in Rwanda and Kenya led to better outcomes already. And legal pathways have also reduced trafficking and created more sustainable justice. From a negative perspective, from the comparative outcomes, CMPs failed to help domestic workers and those migrating abroad. If you look at the Kenya-Saudi labor bans, for example, that directly reduced abuse of workers from Kenya attempting to take advantage of opportunities in Saudi Arabia. And so this is best for debaters, I think, who want to sort of center empirical examples and outcomes and the impacts on direct stakeholders for that type of case. And why do I have these different types of cases? Because I think it's useful for you to think about, wow, really what, and it might not be something you ever even thought about before. In other words, you may have just been, I've been talking to my partner about arguments. We never even thought about what type of case we wanted to run. But let me suggest to you, thinking about what type of case you want to make will help you better understand how your case sits in the debate. And if you, for example, come across a different type of case, and are you prepared to debate that? In other words, are you prepared to, even if you're going to take a policy approach, are you prepared to debate someone who's taking a more philosophical, value-based approach talking about justice? How would you deal with that? These are questions you need to ask yourself when you're constructing your cases. Next, two more case types in this section. Okay, harms-based case. So harms-based case focuses on which model better addresses sort of the most serious injustices or harms. So usually that means you start with sort of your key, identifying what are your key harms, and they should be significant harms. Now, like, don't just pick something that's unimportant or that's inconsequential. Like, this is something that's a big deal. And you can establish the significance of harms either quantitatively, that's with numbers, statistics, etc., or qualitatively. Qualitatively being, well, if we're not just looking at numbers or like the impact on like lives, what other values might it impact about the quality of life, for example? So you could describe the significance of a harm in other ways besides numbers, right? So for example, if I was describing homelessness and I want to say, well, homelessness was a significant problem, I might say, oh, you look at the number of people who are homeless, there are, 1 million people who are homeless. So therefore it's a significant problem. Or I might describe the condition of being homeless in terms of what does your quality of life look like when you have no shelter. And that might be a different way to establish that homelessness is a significant problem that we should care about in society. And so back to the context of our topic, from an affirmative perspective, when you look at a harms-based case, you could think about how the CMP eliminates conditions that lead to informal migration and risk compared to the negative, where targeted protections directly address those mostly affected by the worst harms. Again, what are the worst harms? Well, it's for you to identify. This is best for debaters who really like to argue from the perspective of to make justice tangible through storytelling and urgency. All right, last option, feasibility pragmatism. So this focus here is that even if the CMP is good in theory, is it a workable policy in practice? Because sometimes we get these ideas for policies that sound good theoretically. United States of Africa. But will that actually work? I don't know. So is it workable in practice? Affirmative. Affirmative would be more preemptive here. CMP already, because why? Because the CMP already exists, but what's needed is the political will, not reinvention. Compared to the negative might say, well, look, the implementation has failed for the last 15 years. So how much longer do we want to continue pushing for the full implementation of an obviously failed policy? It'd be better for us to focus on reforms that can actually help people now, rather than focusing on that failed implementation. So this is, I think, best for practical minded teams who want to focus on sort of real world barriers and policy timelines to getting things done, as opposed to more, let's call it, aspirational goals. So those are five different case types. Before I move on and start talking about case construction strategy, any questions? None. Cool. Let's talk a little bit about case construction strategy. And thank you for bearing with me here. We started at about 1:10. We're about an hour in. I'm not gonna go, if you're wondering how long is this guy gonna talk, I'm not gonna go for more than another 30 minutes, and I will stay and take your questions at the end if you're just wondering how long this lasts. Okay, so case construction strategy. So when you're starting off putting together your case, you want to start with sort of a thesis in mind. So thesis for a case is no different than a thesis for a paper. You could think about it almost, if you had to explain what your case was about in a sentence or two, what would you say? What would it be about? Oh, I see your question in the chat. Kavithe, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly though. How does one weigh each case to decide who wins? I will come to that at the end. I will come to that. That's an impact. That's an impact weighing question. And just know that at the tournament, there will be a judge briefing that everyone will have equal access to, where we will be giving judges instructions on how to weigh cases and who wins. But this very simple answer to that is, who is the most persuasive? And they're like, what? Who's the most persuasive? That doesn't give me much guidance on who's going to win. I'll try to unpack that for you a little bit more, but that really is the standard based on the arguments that the judges hear and their comparison and evaluation of the arguments in light of everything that we've said. Who did they find to be more persuasive? All right, case construction strategy. So you start with the thesis, then we think about three-point structure. I like a lot of things in threes, you'll find. So that's why I said 2 or 3 arguments. And usually for those arguments, I usually say 2 or 3 sub-points to support that argument. If you're outlining your arguments in your cases, and generally, I think it's a good idea to outline your cases. And then lastly, make sure you're supporting your case once you're constructing it, that is supported with, by the topic. It says topic packet. That doesn't mean you have to cite evidence that I gave you in the topic packet, but it does mean that your case shouldn't be inconsistent with the topic statement, right? You do want to have empirical data to support your case, and then whatever your legal ethical analysis may be. So let's talk about some sample case structures, because we talked about case types, but case structures are a little bit different, and you'll see that in a second. In other words, case type is like, what type of case did I decide to write? Like if I'm a war general and I'm writing like a war plan, what type of strategy do I want to employ? Whereas when you talk about case structure, that's like, okay, how am I going to actually deploy this? Like, how am I going to implement this in the round? And so let's go through these different ways to structure cases and to actually implement your, whatever case type you want in the round. We've got mechanism-based, justice principle-based, harm reduction-based, comparative effectiveness, stakeholder impact-based, problem cost solution. And I don't know about you all, but I'm feeling a little parched. I think I need a little break. So let's do this. I usually do this when I'm teaching classes anyway. Let's take maybe like a 3-minute comfort break. It's like eight, it should be 9:14 your time, I believe. Let's come back on 17 minutes after the hour. But let's take like a 3-minute comfort break if someone needs to go to the bathroom, grab a drink of water, whatever. And I'll be right back myself in 3 minutes. I should have said you don't have to log out. You can just like step away, but don't log out. It's like, how come people log out? But I'm not logging out. I'm just stepping away for a second. Okay, everyone. 3-minute break turned into a 5-minute break, but that's okay. I'm back. So let's go through some of these sample case structures. Hopefully everyone got a chance to get a drink and was comforted during the comfort break. All right, so a mechanism-based structure, you might want to use this when your case is a policy case or a pragmatic case that is focusing on how the CMP works. So you can see an example here is contention 1, CMP removes structural barriers to justice. You might want to focus on permit fee waivers, labor mobility, put some data in there from Rwanda, Kenya. Then contention 2, CMP improves labor rights through regional coordination. Talk about things like shared enforcement of minimum standards and contrast that with fragmented national protections. And then contention 3, CMP reduces exploitation by creating safe legal pathways. And you could talk about the impact on trafficking and informal labor. Note one thing that's common, that you're going to see common through all of these different structures, which is that each contention is its own sort of independent argument, meaning that even if I lost, let's say, contention 2, CMP improves labor rights through the regional coordination. Let's say they had some really good arguments as to why regional coordination doesn't really improve labor rights. I can still win the debate by showing that, well, it removed the barriers to justice and we reduced exploitation. So I still got significant enough reasons for you to vote for me if I'm on the affirmative and I presented a case in this structure. In other words, I always try to structure my arguments or my contentions. That's all a contention means. A contention means argument. Structure my contentions so that they are independent for one another, so that again, all your eggs aren't in one basket. Secondly, let's say you had a justice-based structure where you're grounding your case in a specific justice philosophy, like equal opportunity, for example, right? So you might have contention 1, justice requires systemic equality of opportunity. And then you can explain why that's true theoretically, and then you can add why the CMP is sort of an institutional equalizer of opportunity. You might want to reference John Rawls as a philosopher about justice, or you might want to reference the African Union Charter to sort of help set up that justice framework. Contention 2, CMP best embodies African regional justice and solidarity. You could then incorporate Pan-African political theory to support that. And you could add regionalism as collective self-determination. And then you add contention 3, CMP ensures justice for the future generations of EAC workers. And you could put the emphasis on sustainability and generational fairness. Notice this is a very more of a political theory type of case, principled case, I would say, very different than that previous pragmatic more policy-based mechanistic case I just showed you. Jones, question. Every time I see you pop open, I think maybe you have a question. If you don't have one, it's okay. But I saw you pop open. No, okay, cool. I'll keep it moving then, in the interest of time. Because I do see we're losing people, and I apologize if I'm going long, but I wanted to give you a lot to think about on case structure. So harm reduction structure, use this when you want to frame the case around solving concrete injustices and social harms. Again, as an example here, you can see the 3 contentions: CMP reducing irregular migration and trafficking, CMP addresses root causes of labor exploitation, contention 3, CMP promotes safer and more formalized employment. But as you can see, there are 3 different harms, right, that are being focused on for each contention. So the first contention is focusing on the harm of trafficking. The second contention is focusing on the root causes of labor exploitation. And the third one is focusing on, promoting safer, more formalized employment, which lead to better outcomes like health, income, rights enforcement. So these are 3 very different points, very different arguments. Next option, comparative effectiveness structure. This is when your goal might be to prove the CMP achieves better results than recruitment protection policies. So 1, CMP outperforms isolated protections. CMP has stronger enforcement mechanisms. CMP builds longer-term foundation for labor justice. Notice, each one of these contentions is comparing the CMP to recruitment protection policies, but in 3 different ways. So each contention reflects a different way that the CMP gets compared, or a different metric. The first metric, right, being these labor protections, the second one being enforcement mechanisms, and then the third one being what's best for labor justice long-term. All right, fourth way to structure, stakeholder impact. Use this maybe when you want to center your case around the people who are affected most. So contention 1, CMP empowers low and middle income workers across the EAC. Contention 2, the CMP reduces exploitation of youth and women in informal labor. And 4, CMP benefits national economies and employers. Notice each one of these contentions focuses on a different stakeholder. Each one's focusing on a different stakeholder. That's the for the structure. And again, which one of these options is best for you? Well, it depends. Depends on your research, and it depends on what you want your focus to be and how you want to win the debate. Ooh, question, Ebenezer.
I just had a question about the comparative effectiveness structure.
Yep.
I just wanted to understand, what would you be comparing CMP with? Would you just be comparing it with placebo, like if CMP wasn't mobilized?
No, good question. No, you're comparing it generally with prioritizing recruitment and protection policies for workers. That's what you're comparing it with. So, for
Okay.
example, if you look at contention 2, right, it says the CMP has a stronger enforcement mechanism. Why? Because it says binding protocol, right? The CMP is supposed to be a binding protocol on CMP member states, right, in the EAC, compared to just having some type of weak local implementation that that you have if you're just talking about like individual nations trying to protect workers through their own policies. That's why one example that I gave you, right, for an affirmative case, and these example case structures are kind of written from an affirmative perspective. But if you recall, one example I gave you was having the East African Court of Justice, right, be a body that can then enforce and protect workers' rights under the CMP, because it is supposed to be a binding protocol on everyone. And so maybe that greater degree, that greater mechanism for enforcement, then that accrues its own unique benefits. Because after all, once you adopt any policy or you introduce any policy, a question of how do we enforce that always comes into place. We see these problems, for example, right, with the International Court of Justice. It's like a lot of people think that it's a pretty weak institution, right, because it lacks strong international enforcement mechanisms. Great. Going back, we covered that. Let's go past stakeholder. So we are coming to the end here. So thank you all for hanging in here with me. So framing and advocacy, what does this mean? Well, these are sort of the things I was getting the questions about, well, how do we know we're winning this debate? How do we know we have the best arguments? Well, number one, you want to have good rhetoric in this format, which means good eye contact. You don't want to just bring your paper, your research, your case, and just hold it up. If you can see me on camera, if this is your 6-minute speech, this is not a good speech. See what I'm doing? I'm blocking myself. You don't want to just read. You want to have good eye contact. You want to use your voice. You want to avoid filler words. You want to present a rhetorically persuasive speech. Secondly, you should think about what your narrative strategy is going to be. You know, like from the affirmatives perspective, you might be thinking about as a theme, right, how borders shouldn't block opportunities for people. From a negative, you might think about how justice starts with protecting those who are most vulnerable within our East African community. So think about the narrative, the story that your case is also telling, not just the raw arguments and the evidence and just the facts, but what is your narrative? So that goes into how you're framing the debate. And then lastly, the impact framing. And so this is what gets to like, how do I know my argument is the best? How do I know my strongest argument? That question I got earlier. And the answer is look at how you how you're think about how you're going to weigh your impacts in the debate. And there are a lot of ways to weigh impacts. Generally speaking, these are 4 metrics that are commonly used in debate to weigh impacts. The first is scope, which is how many people are affected, or in this case, how many workers are affected. Magnitude, sort of what kinds of harms are prevented and what's the, how big are these harms? Are they like really, really big deals or really, really, really small deals in terms of magnitude? Probability, how likely is the event? Meaning in the context of this debate, how likely is it that I'm going to accomplish everything I said I was going to accomplish? Is it like have a good chance of happening? Or is it maybe? Is it a maybe? Generally speaking, I'll tell you, the further away something is in the future, the harder it is to predict compared to something that is closer in time. Why? Because there could be so many intervening causes that could derail or propel that thing from happening. And then lastly, time frame, which is how soon are these results going to be achieved? Will I achieve this stuff tomorrow? Okay, we adopt your plan for full implementation of the CMP tomorrow. Does everything change overnight? Or does it take a long time? How long does it take? 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? I don't know. But time frame. So I think if you start thinking about the impact of your arguments, weigh through these 4 metrics, scope, magnitude, probability, time frame, then that will help give you a way to sort of compare. And also think about what is your opponent going to argue against your case? What are the likely arguments that you're going to hear? How would you refute your own case or test it? Give it to someone on your team to say, hey, what do you think the arguments are against? And then consider the most likely arguments against your case and what the impacts of those arguments are like to be compared to the impacts you're claiming. And sort of you, as a thought experiment, you can start to weigh the impacts yourself in terms of preparing for the debate. You really should have this debate in your head probably 4 or 5 times before you ever get to the tournament. So one reason why I always encourage people to do practice rounds or practice debates, because they really help you think about your case and really flesh it out. Lastly, how do I know my case is good though, Prof? I've heard all this complicated lecturing about case types and case structure and organizing my research. And I think I got my research together. I think I figured out what type of case I want to run. I think I figured out how I want to structure that case. I think I put it together well. I've got a good story. I've got my narrative. I know how I think about justice. I'm ready to go. But how do I know my case is good? I'm done. Well, here are 4 things you should be thinking about to know your case is good. Number 1, does it fit within the 6 minutes? Because you could have the best case in the world, but if it's like a 10-minute case, it's probably not good because you're never going to get to it all. It's got to fit within the time. So like practice your first speech, read it before you get to the tournament several times. If you're negative, your first speech should actually be less than 6 minutes. Why? To save time to rebut the affirmative case. You want to spend at least some time, I think, in that very first negative constructive, saying something about the affirmative case, which means your first negative speech that you prepare should be a little bit less than 6 minutes in terms of what you prepared. Second thing, do you know your main pieces of evidence? Well, whatever the key evidence that supports the main thesis of your case should be available and known by you. You'll probably find that a lot of good debates come down to maybe only a few key pieces of evidence that really ground the claims that you are making. Thirdly, is your case well organized? Like your case should have clear structure that make it very easy for the judge to follow all of the points that you're making. Like a long narrative rambling case is going to sound disorganized even if in your mind it's organized. So you need to clearly articulate what your structure is for your case and then follow that structure so that everybody else in the debate can follow along. And then lastly, do you know how your case proves the resolution true? Do you know how your case proves the resolution true? You should understand how the thesis of your case establishes the truth of your side of the motion. Meaning, if I'm going to say, all right, I'm affirmative, I decided to run a case where we're going to eliminate all permit fees, I should know why the elimination of all permit fees means that full implementation of the CMP is going to create a just migration system in East Africa, and why that's going to be better than prioritizing recruitment and protection measures. And I should know. I should be able to explain that. Why? I'm going to be cross-examined for 4 minutes. Remember, there's a 4-minute cross-examination after every speech. So you need to understand how your case proves the resolution true, and you need to be able to answer questions about your case in that spirit. Lastly, reminder, frame your case around justice, try to link arguments to practical or moral principle impacts, use structure to clarify and persuade, and make sure you're prepared to clash directly with the other side's framework, whatever that may be, and you will be very well prepared. Q&A. What challenges do you all foresee in structuring your case for this motion? That's a starter question to start the conversation in case anyone has any questions. And if you don't have any questions, what's your answer to that question? What challenges do you foresee in structuring your case? You all have cases. You didn't even need this lecture. You're all ready to
go. Yes. So if I would go first, I think the biggest challenge here it relates to the question that I asked before. Like, if we choose to go with the strategy of generalizing or specifically targeting, our framework for, justice.
Yes.
So that's like the first challenge, right? So, the way if I'm affirmative or if I'm against the motion, then I choose a certain definition of justice that I think that in itself sort of shows whether it will be complicated for me to defend my case or it will be easy for me. So I think that the first challenge would be sort of trying to define justice in my perspective, whether it's affirmative or negative.
Yeah. And you may find that, listen, if your opponent hasn't really thought about this in terms of how they're framing justice, and you have, and then you present that, they don't even refute it because they didn't think about it. They just move on to the arguments. That next speech is going to be very, very easy, because then I'm going to be standing up saying, hey, look, my opponent has accepted my framework for what justice is and what justice means. And you might be able to explain why you win the entire debate just off of that framework without even necessarily having to refute any of their factual points or evidence.
That would be really great. If I think that would be a walk in the park if that even happens.
Yeah, it's going to happen for some people, I promise you. Everyone's not in this lecture, first of all, right? Well, we have, I understand we're going to have about 50 to 60 teams. That's 100 to 120 debaters. We've had maybe 25 people in this lecture. So everyone, I don't know how many, we're going to post the lecture online, but I don't know how many people will watch it. So we're certainly making the information available to everyone. Justice is fairness. Everyone's getting an equal opportunity to hear everything. Will they take it? Will the outcome at the end, will they be saying that it's actually fair? Because the outcome, maybe they'll be saying, no, prof, you should have called me on the phone and gave me a personal lecture. Told me everything. These people had an advantage. You gave them all kinds of stuff. Well, we gave it to you too. Yeah, but I didn't see it, so it's not fair. Really? Okay. More questions. All right, feedback from me. How was this lecture? Was this helpful? Do you guys feel like you can construct your cases a little bit better now, or what? What do you think?
Yeah, I think this was very, as a matter of fact, for me, I think I already have an idea of how. Oh, so I see Ebenezer's hand. Okay, so let me say this very quickly so Ebenezer has a chance as well. So I really think that from this lecture alone, I think I already have a complete picture of how I'm going to approach the debate and I only have to do my research and add in a little bit of things. So this was more than helpful. It's like somebody came in, I was in battle. Yeah, you could use this. You could use this and actually find your way, in the winning side of the debate. So this is very helpful. It's very impactful, and yeah, I believe our cases during the tournament will actually be the testimony of what happened.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen now just because I want to make sure I see everybody's faces now as well. And we came to the end of the PowerPoint anyway. So, all right, Ebenezer, your question. Go ahead.
It was just primarily feedback. I really liked how like we were able to get different case types. For me, that I think that ultimately makes or breaks my cases, because I often have quite a lot of ideas, but then finding a way to structure it in a way that makes sense to listeners, I think was something that I struggled with in the past. But now that I know different case types that I can follow, it gives me a much more clear structure that I think I'll definitely use during the debate.
Great. Happy to hear that.
Is it possible to share the slides? Because I have classmates
I'm
who
sharing
might.
all the slides. I've already emailed the entire slide deck to Farissa. I think she's going to post it in. Farissa, if you're there, are you still there? Fell asleep. But I think she's going to post it in the SJD WhatsApp group to share with everybody.
All right, thank you so much.
And I'll just say Clara, Kavith, Mame, Faith, thank you all for hanging in there with me to the end. And I think this will conclude our session, everyone. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you next lecture. Or I'm not sure if I'm giving another one before I get to Tanzania. So this might be the last lecture for me before I board the plane. But I think we have a couple more lectures in the series to help you all get prepared. But I will be doing a live lecture in Arusha, so look out for that. It'll be focused on like practicing cross-examination. By then, everyone should have their cases, I hope. This is going to be the day before the tournament starts. So all right, great. Well, good evening, everyone. Take care.
Hey, bye.